Mark, so what is interesting in this stage, we can see the sign that there might be used different unconventional ways to influence Trump administration, in particular when you speak about Russia, and maybe just not that, connected to not just political figures. So what we know about that, how probable is that, what should we watch out?
Well, it's interesting because precisely when you say what do we know about it, the honest answer is in detail often very little. But in practice it is clear we have an increasing array of cases relating to a whole variety of different figures, whether it's the former National Security Advisor General Flynn, whether it's Trump's own family or whatever, of people who clearly have had access and have had contacts that one wouldn't expect in, shall we say, a normal American administration. And what it speaks to, I would say, is that there is a certain culture at work in this administration, which essentially is very permissive. It's permissive about people who might have dubious backgrounds, dubious activities, but the point is if they're useful, if they're flattering, if they can bring business contracts or whatever, then they get through the door. And therefore, although I've never really accepted this notion of that somehow Trump is some kind of Russian puppet or whatever, I think it's more that this is an administration which is open to being hired, shall we say, in very specific cases. And whether it's the Russians or whether it's China or whoever else, the point is that's the culture at work. It's a culture which is actually permissive of such non-formal, non-traditional contacts.
We had recently a couple of scandals connected to some, I don't know, Ukrainian MP reaching out to Michael Flynn or Saturn, who turned to be the friend of Trump, but it's all so confusing for the public that they just don't really understand what makes sense, what doesn't.
Well, that's the thing, exactly. It is confusing because there is not a nice, single, neat narrative. In some ways, it would be a lot easier if as some say, oh, well, it's clear that President Trump is being blackmailed by the Russians, or something else that has a sort of a nice, clear assessment. But it's not. The real problem is almost one, it sounds ridiculous to put it in these terms, that this is an administration that does not recognize the etiquette of American governance that we have seen in the past. It doesn't matter if they've been Republican or Democrat White Houses. They have accepted a certain sense of this is what you do and this is what you don't do, and particularly that anyone who is closely connected to the president has to be not just beyond reproach, but seen to be beyond reproach. Now we have a president who clearly, first of all, values loyalty almost above everything else. So if you're close to him, unless you do something truly disastrous, then you're safe. Secondly, a president who values the notion of deal-making. Now, deal-making is by definition the opposite of values. It is not there are things that are right and things that are wrong. It's for everything. It's, well, what's the price tag? And the third key element of this particular White House is the way we've seen decision-making move in a non-institutionalized way. It now gets handed out to relatives and friends and close allies. The key decisions are being done in secretive little corners rather than visibly, as we've seen with like negotiations with Congress or even meetings of the usual security bodies. So I think that in some ways, bizarrely, Trump's White House does look quite a bit like Putin's Kremlin, in that exactly it's a sort of a post-institutionalized way. But what it means is there is no clear division between people who are in government and out of government, people who are in Trump's inner circle and people who are outside of Trump's inner circle. And what that means is that, in a way, the whole problem is the very confusing nature of this political system. It's totally deinstitutionalized. And that means that almost anyone can become relevant. We had the case, for example, of Michael Flynn, and that sense of, well, is he being influenced? Well, not only had he taken Russian money through RT, he'd also taken much, much more Turkish money. And again, so the question becomes, well, okay, could he have also been a Turkish agent of influence or whatever? No, we don't know. But that's the thing. There are a lot of people who are making a lot of money out of their connectivity with politics. And we never know what the price tag is, really, what that money is buying. Is it something just simply buying 2 hours of someone's time to give a speech at a dinner? Or is it actually buying access into the central policy-making circles of this White House?
And you're looking closely at the way the Kremlin works, and also how the world of the Russian business and the Russian crime are connected. So what could be the role of that?
Well, this is something that particularly bothers me, and something that I think is very clear. When we talk about the current sort of hybrid war campaign, I don't really like that term, but political war campaign that the Russians are waging against the West. And by the West, it means everything from Ukraine just beyond the battle lines all the way through to the United States and beyond. It is clear that the Russians have essentially adopted an approach to mobilize every asset that is at their disposal. You might be a totally private Russian company or a private Russian individual, but from time to time, the state might come to you and say, we want you to do X. And that could be put some money into a political party in this country, or it might be, as we saw, sort of provide a base for a Russian agent in New York, as came out quite recently.
Not very clear between the particular people who are close to Trump in Russia, like some business for his former business partners or people with that connection who are already there, whom we know, who are the faces.
Well, there are clearly sort of social contacts and business contacts, particularly almost the Trump Tower mafia, the people who, and I use mafia broadly, you know, the people who worked in and out of his own sort of main tower in New York. But I think I'd want to actually focus just on a couple of figures which I think are significant. I mean, Rex Tillerson, the current Secretary of State, I mean, clearly his oil interests mean that he already has a direct relationship with Russia. And although he says he has now sort of divorced himself from his old Exxon contacts, it doesn't work that easily. And he must no doubt be thinking, well, what is he going to do when he's no longer Secretary of State? So there is a direct case of a business contact. You know, Exxon does have very, very strong connections with Russia. The second one I would sort of point out to is a more ideological connection, and that is the Stephen Bannon connection, the man who is the sort of the Rasputin of the White House these days. A guy who has a very radical political and social agenda. And it is clear that not only does he and his movement have all kinds of connections with Russians, ranging from ideologists of the Russian Orthodox Church through to people who are sort of much more almost Leninist in their views. But this is clearly a man who looks at a figure like Putin not as a direct example. I mean, I'm not saying that he wants Trump to become America's Putin, but nonetheless, he looks to an authoritarian leader for whom democratic structures are just simply a transmission belt for your instructions rather than real controls. And he's looking at countries like Russia for examples. So, I mean, I think it's clear that we have both ideological as well as business politics at work within the White House at the moment.
There was a big, I won't say controversy, but still this scandal or something on the Russian dossier of the security service intelligence agencies of the US and Trump. There was this kind of an alternative dossier which we still don't know what is fake in that, what is not. Did you find anything interesting and what was special, and what really are the things we still can confirm which maybe are not confirmed by the intelligence?
There was one sentence that I think really was significant, and that was when they actually expressed a view with a very high degree of confidence that Russia had been behind the electoral manipulation, which is basically pretty much what we knew. But it's almost impossible to have really strong confidence of the original source of a cyber attack if all you're going on is computer forensics, if all you're doing is actually just following the virtual trail in cyberspace, because there could always be one more layer. That computer in Moscow could actually have been slaved to a computer in Beijing, Pyongyang, wherever. So if they actually are willing to go and say we have high confidence in something, which is a very kind of technical term within the context of the US intelligence community, they're pretty much saying we have alternative additional sources that say this. Now we have no idea what it is, and they can't obviously even hint at what it is, whether it's actually agents on the ground in Russia or some other connection. So but basically I think that line told us what we needed to know, which is actually that there is true, serious evidence demonstrating that it was indeed the Russians who were behind it. But more generally, I mean, what can we sort of learn about this? We learn a lot more by looking at Moscow than we do by looking at what's coming out of Washington. And what's interesting is Moscow has kind of gone through multiple sort of almost waves of opinion. At first, when Trump was elected, yes, the clownish nationalists like Zhirinovsky were all, you know, popping the champagne corks. But actually the Russian professionals, the diplomats and national security professionals, I mean, were clearly really quite taken aback and worried. They had no idea what a Trump White House would mean. And although Trump was saying nice things there and then about Russia, they knew it wouldn't necessarily or wouldn't be likely to last, and that Trump could change his opinions immediately. So we had an initial period of concern. Then we moved into a period in which actually they began to try and sort of really scope out Trump. We began to see a few little provocations, a spy ship moving up and down the East Coast, some cruise missiles deployed in violation of treaty. You know, other things, just to more or less see, well, okay, let's just try and get a sense of quite where Trump lies. And I think we're now moving into a third stage, which for me is a much more worrying stage, is they more or less, I think they feel that they've, on the one hand, I think, written off Trump as a long-term strategic partner. They're not going to get what they want, which is some kind of grand Yalta 2.0 deal that divides Europe between America and would more or less, incidentally, put Ukraine into Russia's sphere of influence. They're not going to get that. But I think what they have learned is precisely that not only does Trump not really care about foreign policy when it's not about bombing jihadists or building walls in Mexico, but more to the point that precisely that this is likely to be an administration which is able to be manipulated, which is up for all kinds of different forms of covert penetration, intrusion.
And who would be these other players globally? Because, you know, like, Putin wants that the world is all about the US-Russian relations.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know at this stage because we are in a very, I mean, I think we sometimes forget just how early we still are in the Trump presidency. I mean, this is after all an administration which still hasn't filled its staff positions and such like. Nonetheless, I think we're beginning to see just sort of a few cases. I mean, China has always been a player, well, in recent time, a player in Washington. And as I understand it, the Chinese are beginning to sort of bulk up their economic presence and lobbying presence in Washington. So obviously they've identified it as a kind of a potential opportunity for them. And interesting that we saw one of the things that when Trump was on the election trail and in his early days in office, he was very, very tough on China. If anything, he was presenting China as the greatest geopolitical rival for the United States. He was pointing to things like China's construction of artificial islands in the South China Sea and so forth as sort of, in almost warlike terms. We've seen his position shifting. We've seen him actually becoming much, much softer on China. Now again, we'll wait and see quite how that shakes down. But one way or the other, either Trump has, himself has realized that there are personal interests at stake, or there are those around him who have encouraged him to adopt a much, much more congenial line towards China. So I think we're already beginning to see some impact there. But let's be perfectly honest. I mean, I think this is going to be a situation in which even relatively small countries can play their opportunities to influence small aspects of policy. Again, I mean, at this point, I sort of can't give names, but I remember I was talking to someone quite recently who worked for one of the large Washington-based consultancy firms, who were saying absolutely, not only is all of a sudden there is a lot more interest in buying consultancy time, buying the opportunity to try and lobby in Washington, but actually it's coming from a much, much wider and more diversified range of national bodies. I mean, up to this point, that company had basically dealt with 3 governments. Most of its business, 90% of its business was down to 3 governments. Now they're saying, we've got about a dozen different governments that we're talking to. So I think this is something that is actually now only just now beginning to happen, but it's definitely happening.